Berlin, January 30th, 1943. The morning air is bitter, -12 degrees. Frost clings to the stone facades of the Reich capital, and across the city banners snap in the winter wind. Today marks 10 years since the regime took control. 10 years of the 1,000-year Reich. Inside the Haus der Rundfunks, Germany's central broadcasting house, technicians prepare for the most important radio address of the year. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, the most decorated officer in the regime, is scheduled to speak at precisely 11 a.m. His voice will carry across every radio in the greater German Reich. Millions will listen. The hall falls silent. Göring approaches the podium. The red light blinks on. And then, air raid sirens. Not a drill, not a mistake. The unthinkable is happening. Enemy aircraft. Over Berlin, in broad daylight. Sirens and impacts echo across the city. The broadcast cuts to static. Göring never speaks. The master of the Luftwaffe, the man who once boasted that no enemy bomb would ever fall on the capital, stands frozen as unarmed wooden aircraft roar overhead at 400 miles per hour. But to understand how a plane made of birch and balsa could silence the most powerful air force on Earth, we must go back 3 years, to a desperate gamble that almost never left the drawing board. September 1940. Britain stands alone. The Battle of Britain rages overhead. Every day Spitfires and Hurricanes claw into the sky to meet waves of German bombers. And every day the mathematics of war grow more desperate. Aircraft losses are staggering. Aluminum stockpiles are dwindling. The factories cannot keep pace with the heavy losses. At the de Havilland Aircraft Company in Hatfield, north of London, a radical idea takes shape. Chief designer Geoffrey de Havilland and his team propose something that sounds like madness. A fast bomber built almost entirely of wood. The Air Ministry is sceptical. Wood belongs to the last war, to biplanes and canvas, to an era before metal monoplanes ruled the sky. Building a modern combat aircraft from timber seems like a step backward, a retreat into nostalgia when the nation needs innovation. But de Havilland understood something the bureaucrats did not. Britain was running out of aluminum. The metal was needed for Spitfires and Lancasters, for engines and armaments. There simply was not enough to go around. Yet Britain had access to something else entirely, something the Germans could not easily bomb or blockade. Wood. Not just any wood. The design called for a specific combination of materials. Ecuadorian balsa for the lightweight core, birch plywood for the outer skin, and, critically, Canadian yellow birch for the fuselage structure. Strong, flexible, abundant. Harvested from the vast forests of Quebec and Ontario and shipped across the Atlantic in quantities the Luftwaffe could never fully interdict. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. A wooden airframe could be manufactured by furniture makers and piano builders, craftsmen whose skills were not needed in metal aircraft factories. It would free up aluminum for fighters. It would disperse production across small workshops that were difficult to target. And because wood was lighter than metal for equivalent strength, the aircraft could be faster. But the Air Ministry remained unconvinced. They wanted guns, turrets, defensive armament. Every bomber in the Royal Air Force carried machine guns and crew to operate them. The idea of an unarmed bomber seemed reckless. De Havilland argued back. If the aircraft was fast enough, it would not need guns. Speed would be its defense. It would simply outrun anything the Luftwaffe sent to intercept it. No guns meant no gunners. No gunners meant less weight. Less weight meant more speed and greater range. The arguments went back and forth for months. Air Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman championed the project within the ministry. He fought for funding. He fought for priority. And for his trouble, the aircraft acquired a mocking nickname among its critics, Freeman's Folly. The skeptics believed it would never work. A wooden aircraft flying unarmed into the heart of Nazi Germany. It was a fantasy, a gamble built from lumber and glue and desperation. Yet Freeman persisted. De Havilland persisted. And in November 1940, the prototype took to the sky for the first time. The performance was extraordinary. The aircraft was faster than a Spitfire. It could outclimb most fighters in the Luftwaffe inventory, and it was made from materials that German bombs could not deny to Britain. They called it the Mosquito. But raw speed on a test flight was one thing. The question that haunted Bomber Command was whether this wooden wonder could survive where it truly mattered, deep inside enemy airspace where radar stations watched and night fighters prowled. The Mosquito was unlike anything the world had seen. From the outside, it appeared almost delicate. A sleek twin-engine airframe with graceful elliptical wings, and a streamlined fuselage that seemed sculpted by wind rather than engineers. The plywood skin was smooth to the touch. Run your hand along the surface and you would feel the craftsmanship of woodworkers who had spent their careers building cabinets and boats and furniture. But beneath that elegant exterior was a machine built for war. Rolls-Royce's Merlin engines, the same powered the Lancaster, each one producing nearly 1,500 horsepower. Together they could push the Mosquito to speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. At a time when most frontline fighters struggled to reach 350, the aircraft could climb to 36,000 feet, higher than most German interceptors could effectively operate. It had a combat range of over 1,500 miles, and it could carry 4,000 pounds of bombs, the same payload as the much larger Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. But raw performance statistics only told part of the story. The Mosquito possessed another advantage that its designers had not fully anticipated, an advantage that would prove decisive in the months and years ahead. It was nearly invisible to radar. German radar stations along the occupied coasts relied on radio waves bouncing off metal surfaces. The steel skins of Lancasters and Halifaxes reflected those signals clearly. Operators could track formations from hundreds of kilometers away. They could vector night fighters to intercept. They could alert flak batteries to prepare. But wood behaved differently. The birch and balsa construction of the Mosquito absorbed and scattered radar signals, rather than reflecting them cleanly. The aircraft appeared as a faint ghost on German screens. Sometimes it did not appear at all. Operators would dismiss the fleeting contact as interference or atmospheric disturbance. By the time they realized their mistake, the Mosquito was already gone. The Germans called it the Holzmucke, the wooden Mosquito. They spoke the name with grudging respect and mounting frustration. How do you stop an aircraft you cannot see coming and cannot catch once it arrives? By late 1942, Mosquito squadrons were ranging across occupied Europe with near impunity. They struck precision targets in broad daylight. They photographed fortifications and troop movements. They harassed German industry and disrupted railway networks. And the losses were remarkably light. The wooden wonder was proving its skeptics catastrophically wrong. But Air Vice Marshal Donald Bennett wanted more. Bennett commanded the Pathfinder Force of Bomber Command. His squadrons flew ahead of the main bomber streams to mark targets with flares. He understood the psychological dimension of strategic bombing. It was not enough to destroy factories and shipyards. You had to break the enemy's will. You had to humiliate them. And in January 1943, an opportunity presented itself. January 30th marked the 10th anniversary of the Nazi seizure of power, Adolf Hitler's rise to Chancellor, the beginning of the 1,000-year Reich. The Nazi propaganda machine was planning a day of celebration. Radio addresses by senior leadership, speeches proclaiming German invincibility. Hermann Goering himself would address the nation at 11 in the morning. Joseph Goebbels would follow in the afternoon. The entire Reich would be listening. Bennett proposed an audacious strike. Send mosquitoes to Berlin itself, not at night under cover of darkness. In broad daylight. Time the attack to coincide precisely with the radio broadcasts. Force the Nazis to interrupt their own celebrations. Demonstrate to the German people that the Luftwaffe could not protect even the capital city, even on the most important day of the Nazi calendar. The plan was approved at the highest levels. 3 Mosquitoes from 105 Squadron would attack at 11 in the morning during Goering's speech. 3 more from 139 Squadron would strike in the afternoon during Goebbels. The targets were the broadcasting facilities themselves. The Haus des Rundfunks in the west of the city, the transmitter station in the east. To reach Berlin, the crews would have to fly nearly 600 miles across the most heavily defended airspace in Europe. The route would take them over the North Sea and across the German coast, past radar stations and fighter bases and flak concentrations. The solution was to fly lower than the enemy thought possible, wave-top height across the North Sea, 50 feet above the grey winter swells, below the effective detection range of coastal radar, then hedge-hopping across the frozen German countryside, following railway lines and rivers, using the terrain itself as cover. The Mosquitoes would appear over Berlin before the defenders knew they were coming. 6 aircraft, 6 crews, 12 men flying unarmed into the heart of Nazi Germany in broad daylight on the anniversary of Hitler's rise to power. The morning of January 30th, 1943, dawned cold and clear. At Royal Air Force Marham in Norfolk, the ground crews had been working since before dawn. The Mosquitoes sat on the frozen dispersals with engines ticking as they warmed. The smell of high-octane fuel hung in the still air. Pilots and navigators gathered for final briefings. Maps were studied. Synchronized watches were checked. At 09:30 hours, the first section began their takeoff roll. The Merlins roared. The wooden airframes lifted into the grey English sky and turned east toward the North Sea, toward Berlin, toward Goering, toward a moment that would echo through history. The North Sea stretched beneath them like hammered steel. Squadron leader Reg Reynolds held the control column steady as his Mosquito screamed eastward at nearly 300 miles per hour. 50 feet below the wooden belly of the aircraft, the grey winter swells rolled and churned. One moment of inattention. One gust of wind. One split-second lapse, and they would cartwheel into the freezing water and vanish without a trace. His navigator, Flight Lieutenant Ted Sizemore, crouched over his charts in the cramped cockpit, calculating airspeed and drift, watching for the first glimpse of the enemy coast. There would be no radio communication, no course corrections from home. Once they crossed into German airspace, they were utterly alone. Behind Reynolds flew the other 2 Mosquitoes of the morning section, 3 wooden aircraft racing toward the most heavily defended city in Europe, unarmed, unescorted, relying on nothing but speed and audacity. The Dutch coast appeared ahead, a thin, dark line on the horizon. Reynolds pulled back gently on the stick, and the Mosquito rose just high enough to clear the dunes before dropping back down to treetop height. Frozen fields blurred beneath them. Farmhouses flashed past in an instant. Startled civilians looked up at the thundering shapes overhead, and then they were gone, into Germany. The landscape changed. Industrial towns, rail yards, factory chimneys belching smoke. The Mosquitoes wove between obstacles at 300 miles per hour, following canals and railway lines, using church steeples and water towers as navigation points. The Merlin engines howled at full power. The airframes vibrated with the strain. Anti-aircraft positions opened fire sporadically. Black puffs of flak burst around them, but the gunners had no time to aim properly. By the time they registered the approaching aircraft and swung their weapons around, the Mosquitoes were already past and gone. Moving too fast, flying too low. The minutes ticked by. Sizemore called out checkpoints. Reynolds acknowledged. The cockpit stank of engine oil and sweat and fear. Every second stretched into eternity. Every second brought them closer to Berlin. And then the city appeared. The spires and rooftops of the Reich capital spread across the horizon. Smoke rose from chimneys. Traffic moved through the streets below. The citizens of Berlin went about their morning routines, utterly unaware of what was coming. It was 11 a.m., exactly on schedule. At that precise moment, inside the Haus der Rundfunks, Hermann Goering was preparing to address the nation. The most powerful radio broadcast of the year. Millions of Germans gathered around their wireless sets. The Reichsmarschall stepped toward the podium. The red transmission light glowed. Reynolds pushed the throttles to maximum power. The Mosquito surged forward. The broadcasting house loomed ahead. He lined up his attack run and released his bombs. The explosions ripped through the morning air. Inside the broadcasting hall, the windows shattered. The building shook. Plaster fell from the ceiling. Technicians dove for cover. The carefully orchestrated ceremony dissolved into chaos. Goering never delivered his speech. The transmission cut to static as air raid sirens wailed across the capital. The Mosquitoes swept over the rooftops and banked hard for home. Behind them, columns of smoke rose from the wounded city. Flak batteries opened up across Berlin, but the wooden aircraft were already accelerating away, climbing higher, racing westward, leaving confusion and humiliation in their wake. The second wave was already on its way. 3 more Mosquitoes from 139 Squadron crossed the North Sea that afternoon. Their target was the same city. Their timing was calculated to coincide with Joseph Goebbels' scheduled address at 4 o'clock. The Minister of Propaganda, the voice of the Nazi regime. He, too, would be silenced. The afternoon raiders faced heavier opposition. The Luftwaffe was now fully alert. Fighters scrambled from airfields across northern Germany. Flak batteries stood ready. But the Mosquitoes came in low and fast, just as before. They struck their targets. They disrupted the broadcast. And then they vanished into the winter sky. Of the 6 aircraft dispatched that day, 1 was lost. A single Mosquito shot down by ground fire over Berlin. Its crew lost in action. The price of audacity, the cost of war. But the mission was an overwhelming success. The Nazi propaganda machine had been exposed as impotent. The Luftwaffe had failed to protect the capital on the most important day of the Nazi calendar. And the weapon that humiliated them was made of Canadian birch and balsa wood. The reverberations of that morning would reach the highest levels of the German High Command, and no one would feel the sting more personally than Hermann Göring himself. The news reached Hitler's headquarters within hours. Enemy aircraft over Berlin, in broad daylight, on the anniversary of the seizure of power. The Führer was incandescent with rage. His Air Force had promised him an impenetrable shield. His Reichsmarshal had boasted that no bomb would ever fall on German soil. And now this. Göring retreated from public view in the days that followed. The humiliation was total. The man who had built the Luftwaffe into the most feared air force on earth had been made to look foolish by a handful of wooden aircraft. Aircraft that his fighters could not catch. Aircraft that his radar could barely detect. Aircraft that mocked everything he had built. Weeks later, Göring summoned his aircraft designers and engineers to a conference. He demanded answers. He demanded solutions. And in the course of that meeting, he uttered words that would become infamous among aviation historians. He spoke of the Mosquito, of its speed and versatility, of the impossibility of intercepting it with conventional fighters. And then his composure cracked. "It makes me furious when I see the Mosquito. I turn green and yellow with envy." The Reichsmarshal of the Greater German Reich, the commander of the most technologically advanced air force in the world, consumed with envy over an aircraft made from wood. The Germans had jet engines in development. They had rocket planes on the drawing board. They possessed engineering capabilities that seemed like science fiction, and yet they could not match the performance of an aircraft built by furniture craftsmen using techniques from the previous century. The irony was exquisite. German intelligence scrambled to understand the Mosquito phenomenon. They analyzed crashed examples. They interrogated captured aircrew. They studied every photograph and every report, and what they discovered only deepened their frustration. The aircraft was simple, elegant, efficient. It used materials that were abundant and workers who were readily available. It could be manufactured in small workshops dispersed across the countryside, and it outperformed aircraft that cost 3 times as much to build. The High Command demanded a German equivalent, something fast and wooden and versatile. But German industry was not configured for such production. Their factories were tooled for metal. Their workforce was trained for aluminium and steel. The skills needed to build a wooden combat aircraft had largely disappeared from German manufacturing. Meanwhile, the Mosquito force grew stronger with each passing month. New squadrons formed. New variants emerged. Fighter versions carrying cannons. Reconnaissance versions with cameras. Night fighter versions equipped with radar. The wooden wonder adapted to every role Bomber Command could imagine. And the losses remained remarkably low. By the end of the war, nearly 8,000 Mosquitoes would be built. They would fly over 40,000 sorties. They would strike targets from Norway to North Africa, from the French coast to the heart of Berlin. And throughout it all, they remained the aircraft the Luftwaffe could never truly answer. But the story of the Mosquito was not merely a British triumph. Across the Atlantic, another chapter was being written.
a chapter of Canadian industry and Canadian pride.
The demand for mosquitoes far exceeded British production capacity. In 1942, de Havilland, Canada, established a new manufacturing facility in Downsview, Ontario, just north of Toronto. Canadian workers began building mosquitoes using Canadian materials. The same yellow birch that had proven so essential to the original design now came directly from Quebec and Ontario forests to Canadian assembly lines. By war's end, the Downsview plant had produced over 1,000 mosquitoes. Canadian hands shaped the plywood. Canadian craftsmen fitted the components. Canadian test pilots took each aircraft into the sky for the first time. It was a source of immense national pride, a testament to what Canadian industry could achieve when the need was greatest. Veterans who worked on those assembly lines still remember the smell of wood shavings and aircraft dope, the sound of rivet guns and the whine of lathes, the satisfaction of watching a completed mosquito roll out of the hangar, knowing it would soon be striking at the enemy. And those who lived near the airfields remember something else, the sound of the Merlin engines, that distinctive rumble, that throaty roar that seemed to echo across the Canadian landscape. Mosquitoes taking off on training flights, mosquitoes climbing into the Ontario sky. A sound that became woven into the fabric of wartime memory, a sound that still stirs something deep in the hearts of those who heard it. The mosquito proved that courage takes many forms. It vindicated the visionaries who believed in it when others mocked. It demonstrated that innovation does not always mean complexity. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most elegant. Sometimes the answer is found not in laboratories, but in forests. Canadian lumber helped win the war in the air. Canadian workers built the aircraft that humiliated the Luftwaffe. And on that cold January morning in 1943, Canadian yellow birch flew over Berlin and knocked Hermann Goering off the radio. Some victories are measured in territory captured, some in enemies destroyed. But this victory was measured in something more profound, in the silence of a tyrant, in the chaos of a propaganda broadcast, in the certain knowledge that even the mightiest war machine could be humbled by determination and ingenuity and wood. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.